Welcome to The Point. Well, this evening we've got a wonderful program with the wonderful Dr. Laura, who's going to be teaching us all about common vitamin deficiencies. Laura, welcome to the program.
Hello, Richard. Yes, so common vitamin deficiencies that I see in general practice and how they impact people and how we can actually correct those deficiencies very, very quickly with diet and lifestyle. So that's what we're talking about today.
So that's something really interesting, something we all need to pay attention to, because I've been told by Dr. Laura, who's a practicing GP, unlike me, that these things are very common. So we need to actually look after our diet to make sure we don't get deficient in any vitamins. Now we have to remember that God actually designed our bodies very carefully, very beautifully and wonderfully designed we are, but he also designed the plants and the animals as well. And just to give an illustration, I'm just going to show a short presentation about trees and plants to show you how they are also carefully and wonderfully designed. Hello, my name is Richard Kent. Today I'd like to talk about the miracle of trees and plants and flowers. Now, you may have heard me on other occasions talking about the miracle of photosynthesis. Photosynthesis happens in the chlorophyll of all green plants and is totally necessary for the production of oxygen and starch for humans and animals. But the leaves are very carefully designed and they need a structure to hold them up. We call them trees. So I'm not going to talk about photosynthesis, I'm going to talk about the structures which hold the leaves up. And they are also fantastically engineered by God. They didn't happen by chance, they are designed by God. Now, if you look at a tree in winter, what are you actually looking at? You're looking at a wooden structure which is mostly tubular. Round tree trunks and round branches. These are designed to hold heavy leaves, because if you've ever picked up a branch, they're quite heavy, in the best possible position for the leaves on each individual branch to get the maximum exposure to light from the sun, so the miracle of photosynthesis can take place. Now, you know and I know that tubes are actually very strong. We use tubes a great deal in our own construction. Tubes, sometimes they're tubular and sometimes they're beams. But for example, the Eiffel Tower or the San Francisco Bridge or most man-made structures, skyscrapers, basically the underlying structure is some steel framework. Well, God uses a framework, but it's quite different because wood is quite different. It's a living substance. It's actually quite different from steel or china or glass. All of these things would be totally unsuitable for a tree. Now, what does a tree have to do? Well, first of all, a tree has to get bigger. You plant an acorn, you end up many years later with an oak tree. So first thing the plant has to do is get bigger. Now, nothing we make can actually get bigger. Secondly, a plant has to be very strong, and even in the UK we can frequently have winds up to 40 miles an hour, and very occasionally you have winds up to 90 miles an hour. And most trees can actually survive a wind blowing at that speed. They will simply bend over and then come back to their original shape. Sometimes trees have to adapt to their environment, and you often see trees growing around other trees or trees growing around buildings. God has designed trees in a totally miraculous way by putting within them long tubes. They're called xylem and phloem, which are basically long cells which are ideal for bending and having inherent elasticity, so after they've bent, they come back to their original position. Now, nothing else would actually work. Steel wouldn't work, nothing else would work. Actually, wood is stronger weight for weight than steel. but it's elastic and it actually can rebound, unlike steel, to its original shape. If you've ever seen a car accident, you'll know that a car can't automatically revert to its original shape. Well, trees can. Something more about trees and the plant kingdom generally is that they are designed by God in a very beautiful way according to the golden ratio or the divine ratio. Now, the Ark of the Covenant is in the divine ratio. Noah's Ark is in the divine ratio, for example. And God has created trees and plants and flowers with his own imprint on them, the divine ratio. And not in this program, but in another program, I'll be talking about the divine ratio in humans and the divine ratio in the plants and the trees and the flowers, that you can see God's design in everything we see. Thanks for listening, and God bless you. Right, welcome back to the point. And as you can see that God has designed plants and trees and flowers beautifully, but he's also designed our human bodies in the most amazing way. So I'm going to pass straight on to Laura to tell us about vitamin deficiencies. Laura.
Thanks, Richard. So I'm going to be talking about two particular vitamin deficiencies, the two common ones. There's one that's called the sunshine vitamin, and that's vitamin D. And actually, more than 50% of the population in the UK have got this particular deficiency, vitamin D deficiency. The other one, if we have time, is the B deficiencies, and there are two particular ones. The B12, which is a vitamin called cobalamin, and then there's a B9, which a lot of people know, particularly pregnant women, but they know it by another name, and that's folate. So folate, or folic acid, is actually vitamin B9. It's a B vitamin. But firstly, to the D vitamins. Now, vitamin D, the sunshine vitamin, is ever so important. And as you can see from that diagram, the sun is actually our main source of vitamin D. And vitamin D is synthesized by us. So we actually make vitamin D. The sun hits our skin, and in that skin, that's actually where the production of vitamin D starts. And it gets converted to a pre-vitamin D molecule, which is then passed into the circulation to the liver, where it gets added on more carbon chains. And then from the liver, it gets transported in the blood to the kidneys, where it actually has its final formation. So the vitamin D that comes from the sunlight through the skin to the liver and to the kidneys is actually developed in two parts, but it's fully formed in the kidneys, and then from the kidneys it's transported to all the different organs in the body. And as we know, particularly Richard, do you remember rickets? Well, not personally, but do you remember the history of rickets?
The history of rickets, certainly.
And the reason why people used to have rickets, and the history about why they now have fortified cereals and fortified is because back in the way back, children used to have rickets, and basically had really soft bones, and because the bones were soft, they used to have curved tibia, didn't they? And that's how the rickets came about. And it was found out that the reason for rickets was actually a vitamin D deficiency. So what causes vitamin D deficiency? Lack of sunlight is the main one. And I usually joke with my patients when we discover, I tend to do a vitamin D test on new patients when I see them, because it's such a simple test to do, and anybody can have a test done by the GP. And what I would do is just do a blood test on them. And a lot of them will come back, as I said, up to 50%, even sometimes more, particularly in the over 50 age range, will come back as having a vitamin D level that's less than 50. 50 is a cut-off mark for just being okay. But people will have as low as 30. And in fact, some lab results will come back and say less than 30. So they wouldn't actually give it a figure because it's so low that they can't even tell what the number it is, but it's less than 30. And people like that are severely vitamin D deficient. So sunlight is important. Vitamin D deficiency, it's found a lot in the Western world because we're all working in offices. We all wear, winter, we wear very, thick clothes. Some of us with dark skin, particularly who live in sort of the northern parts of the hemisphere, don't produce as much vitamin D because our pigment prevents, it's a natural sunblock. People are sort of sedentary elderly people, their diet sometimes can cause a lack of vitamin D deficiency. Being overweight, because vitamin D is a fat-soluble vitamin, and what happens is that instead of the vitamin D that we get from the sunlight going into a circulation, it gets mopped up by the fat cells. So actually being overweight can mean people can be vitamin D deficient. Stress, toxins, certain types of medication can also stop the absorption of vitamin D, and certain types of plastics. Have you heard of BPA, the plastic?
I have, yes.
So bisphenol A actually stops the production of vitamin D. So you have all these very healthy people who go to the gym and they're swigging their bottles of water, but if it's made from a plastic that's got BPA in it, then it actually severely affects the production of vitamin D. So clue is, don't use BPA plastics, go for non-BPA plastics to drink. So what's the function of vitamin D? Vitamin D has many functions. That we talked about rickets, that's one of the main functions, as we know, Richard, but nowadays you'd be very, very hard pushed to find a ricket patient in the UK, because we have fortified, the government actually has vitamin D fortification in cereals, in breads, and in lots of foods. But vitamin D is so important, apart from the function with the bone, strengthening of the bone, it's also very important in things like the immune system. And a lot of patients who have recurrent infections, they'll come into the surgery saying, I'm always getting a cold, I'm always getting this, I'm always getting a urine infection. And one of the first things I would do is, what are your vitamin D levels at? What's your diet like? Are you getting enough sun exposure? Are you having vitamin D rich foods? Because vitamin D is actually being shown to be very, very important for boosting the immune system. And the immune system is important in 3 areas, not just for infections like bacteria, viruses, and fungi. The immune system is also very important for prevention of cancer, because what the immune system does is it recognizes when you've got rogue, foreign cells that are different from normal cells. So a person with a healthy immune system is less likely to get cancer. A person with a healthy immune system is less likely to get infections. And the third thing is, a person with a healthy immune system is also less likely to have autoimmunity. So vitamin D has actually been implicated in patients who have an autoimmune condition like rheumatoid arthritis, because again, it's the immune system not behaving normally. So it's important for the immune system, it's important for bones. People who have vitamin deficiency will have muscle bones, bone pains, muscle weaknesses, cramps, and that sort of thing. It's also important for the mood, Richard. And, you know, people who have low moods may have a deficiency in vitamin D. And it's not just the SAD in the SAD, season affective disorder, because of the low sunlight in the October to March season, but it could also be a vitamin D deficiency. So vitamin D deficiency is important also for mood. Depression, anxiety have been linked to low vitamin D production. Fat metabolism as well, hormonal balance, such as the thyroid function, the pancreas function, so diabetes, adrenal function, stress, adrenal excess, production of cortisol, adrenaline. Again, because vitamin D is a pro-hormone, it actually is responsible for helping other chemicals to actually manufacture what they do. So that's broadly what vitamin D deficiency, and as I said, up to 50% of the population do have it. So what do you do? I've already mentioned symptoms. What does a person who's got low vitamin D deficiency, what the person has low vitamin D do? The first thing is that they've got to get some sunlight. But how do we get sunlight, particularly between October and March? Very difficult, because the sun's not out a lot. Best time to get your sunlight, 20 to 30 minutes every day, between 11 a.m. and 3 p.m. Well, lots of people are working at that time, Richard. And yes, they might be able to get a quick one in their lunch break. But again, the problem is we don't get enough sunlight between October and March for people to be hanging around for half an hour outside getting their little bit of vitamin D. So there's another way round, and another way round is to supplement. And actually, there's a product here which I won't actually show you the name of the product because I'm not advertising any product, but this is a spray that you can use for vitamin D, and actually you can spray it in your mouth. But there are other things you can take, capsules, you can take tablets as well to help to supplement your vitamin D deficiency. And normally, what I'd say to my patients when we've done the blood test and that we find out that they are deficient in vitamin D is I tell them, between the winter months, October to March, double the dose. So if you're taking like 1,000 IUs, international units daily, take 2,000 international units between October and March. If they're severely deficient, they might need a higher strength, like 20,000 international units twice a week until it's corrected, and then they can go down to the maintenance dose. So that's how they would do it. Because vitamin D is a fat-soluble vitamin, A, D, E, K, they are the fat-soluble vitamins, so D is one of them. It's best absorbed with some fat, and we're talking about some healthy fats, of course, like avocados, coconut oil, that sort of thing, you know. Take it with a healthy fat, almonds, nuts and butter. Oh, wonderful. Thanks for that, I forgot about that slide. These are the top ways, these are the top foods that people can get the vitamin D supply. So we talked about supplements, which you can get from health food shops, etc. But these are also ways to get vitamin D. On the left there, you've got things like fermented dairy, that's a tofu particularly, obviously non-GMO soy products, but we got eggs. The egg yolk has got some vitamin D as well. Salmon, so oily fish, salmon and sardines. Button mushrooms and shiitake mushrooms are actually quite high in vitamin D as well. So we got eggs, we got fermented dairy products, we got the soy, non-GMO, and oranges, and that's not on there, but oranges are also high. So for those who are vegan, vegetarian, who don't want to have animal products, then you've got the shiitake mushrooms, the button mushrooms, and the oranges as well. So that's really about vitamin D, and I would encourage anyone who doesn't know what their vitamin D levels are is just to request a vitamin D check from your GP, because it's a simple test, simple blood test, and it will make such a difference to you. And I personally have had my vitamin D levels checked, and about 4 years ago they were under 30, unrecordable. Mm-hmm. But now it's 100, etc. because I do take supplements. There's not much sun around, but I do take supplements. So that is
wonderful.
An important, sorry?
I say wonderful.
Yeah, thank you. So
Laura,
that's vitamin D.
Are you about to go on to the next one now?
Yes.
Well, just before you do, if we could please have the first slide up of the vitamin D, because it's so wonderful to hear Laura talking about all the vitamins, but we also need to talk about just how fantastically God has made us. Now, you look at that slide. Laura's been telling us about this vitamin, which is absolutely essential for our human bodies, but a sort of precursor is manufactured in our skin and then modified in the liver and then modified again in the kidneys, and then very important in the bones and also the adrenal glands and the thyroid glands and what have you. Now that is what you call irreducibly complex. Say it again, it's irreducibly complex. As you've heard, Laura's just told us that you can't to be well and active, we must have a fully functioning vitamin D as well as all the other vitamins. But you've seen how complicated it is for the skin to have the precursor from the sunlight, and then to be modified by the liver and the kidneys, and also for the intestine to absorb vitamin D from milk, for example, or other products. But it's all incredibly complicated. It isn't simple. Now, how on earth these evolutionists, these liars, say that life evolved in the primordial slime 3.8 billion years ago, I have absolutely no idea. Because the thing is, it's irreducibly complex, because we must have fully functioning vitamin D and all the other vitamins in order that we may be well and healthy. We can't evolve it over millions of years, because we'll all die. You've got to be right from the beginning. It's called irreducibly complex. I thought I'd just interrupt Laura's really incredible discussion just to make these points. Thank you, Laura.
And actually, that just brings me to a scripture too, actually.
Excellent.
That actually, because God in Genesis 1:29, I'd just like to read this actually scripture to you. Genesis 1:29, it says, "Then God said, I gave you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth, and every tree that has fruit with seed in it, they will be yours for food." And that's amazing because it really goes back to the presentation that you had at the beginning with the trees and the tubes that help to support the trees and the plants, and how God has designed for us to have a basic, primarily a plant-based diet with the addition of animal protein. And with vitamin D, you can get, apart from the sunlight, you can get sources of non-animal protein and vitamin D. So God has actually put that in place. And when we come to the next vitamin deficiency, which is the B category, and I'm dealing particularly with B12 because that's a very common one that I find in general practice, we find that the causes of vitamin B12 deficiency are primarily diet-based. Occasionally, they have difficulties in absorption, and we find that this happens in about 30% of the population would actually have a vitamin B12 deficiency. And the thing about vitamin B12 is it's an essential vitamin, and what that means is that our body can't make it. We've got to have it from outside. Our body can make vitamin D, but our body can't actually make B12. And so who is at risk of having B12 deficiency? We've got people who are over 50, or people who are older than 50, if they have a problem with their digestive tract, Richard, because the digestive tract is so important for absorption of vitamin B12. So if they have celiac disease or gluten intolerance or some other problem like that, gastritis, where they're taking lots of medication that counteracts the acid that's actually needed for the absorption of vitamin B12, they can actually run into problems with vitamin B deficiency. Alcohol abuse as well can again reduce the absorption of vitamin B12. So it's very important that we know about that. What happens if someone has a B12 deficiency? So its functions, first of all, are it's very important for nucleic acid production. So DNA, vitamin B12 is necessary for DNA. It's necessary for the production of red blood cells, so people who become anemic if they don't have enough vitamin B12. Even the white cells and platelets need vitamin B12. It's necessary for the production of the myelin sheath around the nerves, so that's like the insulation that stops the nerves from short-circuiting themselves. B12 and the brain function is also an important aspect of B12, and also for metabolism. So the normal function of the brain, the normal function of the heart as well. B12 has actually been implicated in blood pressure. So it's necessary for that. There's a hormone called homocysteine, which is found in high concentrations in people with B12 deficiency, and homocysteine is directly related to proper cardiac function. So people with vitamin B12 deficiency, they will complain of tiredness and fatigue, unexplained tiredness and fatigue, because primarily there are not enough red cells which are not carrying oxygen to the tissues. They'll look pale. Some people actually have an anemic pallor about them. They have problems with memory and forgetfulness because, again, B12 is necessary for brain function, memory. They may suffer from depression, anxiety. They may also have neurological symptoms, neuropathy, because of the nerves. They may have things like pins and needles, constantly having funny sort of tingly sensations in their fingers and the toes. They may have dizzy spells as well, and they may suffer from muscle weakness, cramps. They may have bowel problems like diarrhea, constipation. They may have problems with their immunity as well because of vitamin B12. So there's a whole range of things that just this particular vitamin can cause people to have. So if you are a patient and you've got any of these symptoms, tiredness, fatigue, poor memory, muscles, nerves, whatever, and you've tried and you've looked at your diet and you think, well, I'm doing as much as I can, as much as I know to do. Again, there's no harm at all. In fact, I'd encourage you to go to your GP and ask them for a blood test. And if the symptoms are the sort that could be a vitamin B12 deficiency, they would get you to have a blood test to see whether you are B12 deficient. So poor diet, poor absorption, people who have indigestion, taking antacids, all those sorts of things will reduce the production, absorption of vitamin B12. Because the way it happens is that when we take in our diet, which is rich in B12 foods, and we'll come in a minute with what foods those are. There we are. These are the meat-eating carnivorous type foods, and unfortunately, with the B12 particularly, it's very, very difficult to get in a vegan, vegetarian diet, and so a lot of them would have to take supplements and things like that. You do have a little bit but not as much as you would do with the meats, the poultries, the eggs, the dairies, fermented dairy, and that sort of thing. But you can get a little bit, but again, not as much. As you can see from those figures, they are not very high, but certainly vegans and vegetarians have to really watch it, and they may need to supplement their diet. But anyway, so vitamin B12 deficiency in a nutshell, diet is primarily the way to get it, but you can take supplements. If you have an autoimmune condition called pernicious anemia, you might need to have the injections given to you by intramuscular injection. I think that's probably all I'm going to say about those. So D and B12, very key, very easily preventable. See your GP if you've got any of those symptoms, and most importantly, have a good look at your diet and see where you can improve things there.
Well, thank you, Laura. It's absolutely wonderful to hear all these amazing way that God has designed us, and also how we can actually be very careful to get enough sunlight and to eat the right things in order that we may not get vitamin deficient. I think you've got a scripture there, actually, to sort of round off the program.
Yes, indeed. Well, here we are. I'm just going to have a quick look at that. So we're looking at Ezekiel 47:12 and Revelation 22:2. Fruit trees of all kinds will grow on both banks of the river. Their leaves will not wither, and nor will their fruit fail. Every month they will bear fruit, because the water from the sanctuary flows to them. And then 1 Corinthians 3:16 says, do you not know that you are God's temple, and God's Spirit dwells in you?
So, thanks for joining us on To The Point. We're here every Monday evening at 8:30, Dr. Laura and myself telling you in different ways how God has fantastically and wonderfully made our human bodies. Thanks for joining us. Please join us next week on To The Point, Dr. Laura and myself. God bless you, and bye-bye.